Shalom, 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 alaikum, which is peace unto you all. Ha'ai rab tawab la atam, za'achikam yawaman or chagadol Charlotte, which is good evening. This is your brother Yawam from the JMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam kaya, hamalakata shamayim kwara, repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call halayim la la abanaw Yahweh, bahasham Yahweh shai, bahasham rachakodash, wamashana, laza konim nawa, wamalakim shar chagadol, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists, bahasham. In the name Yahweh Shai delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is Job chapter 38 and verse 31. And it says, Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazarath in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? All right, and pretty much what sparked this lesson was I wanted to clarify a statement I made at last week's camp, pretty much going into this word for Arcturus, which that's what so-called scholars know as Ursa Major. All right, but the statement that I wanted to clarify was that Ursa Major points directly to what's known as Ursa Major points directly to what's known as the North Star and what they know as Ursa Minor. All right, so instead of it being in Ursa Major, it's actually in what so-called scholars know as Ursa Minor. All right. But again, just wanted to provide for some clarity and get a couple precepts on this topic. I don't want to Zabanaya Paulo's will. This is a beautiful edification through the spirit. All right. So reading it again, Job 38 and verse 31, it says, Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion? All right. In which that's what Orion ultimately goes into a specific constellation. And in Hebrew, all right, it says Kasayah, and it says constellation Orion. The constellation, it says specifically Orion as if a burly one. All right, we'll get this root word, and it says fool, stupid fellow, dullard, simpleton, arrogant one, stupid or silly. All right. And so right here, it says stupid or silly, you see. So essentially that specific constellation embodies this word right here, kasal, because when we go into this word here, going back to this root word, the root word for kasayar, which is the name in Hebrew, all right, kasal ultimately goes into be foolish, to be stupid, to be silly. It says to be fleshy, all right. It says boat, it says apply, it says apply, to be fleshy, to be fat, loin, flank, it says is applied in a good sense to strength, firmness, boldness. All right. So going back, we'll get this right here. All right, because it says kasal, it says the loins as the seat of one's confidence, foolish or proper. All right, and when we go into this right here, what that specific constellation is known for is what they call, what so-called scholars call a belt. All right, it's known for a belt. Give me a second. All right, it's known for the three stars, like right here, in which all the stars essentially have names, but this is pretty much what Esau has ascribed to them. But to get that point, before I move on any further, I'm going to get this real fast. This is Psalms chapter 147 and verse 4. It says, verse 1, it says, Praise ye the Lord, for it is good to sing praises unto our power, for it is pleasant, and praise is comely. The Lord doeth build up Jerusalem. He gathereth together the outcasts of Yasharallah. He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds. He telleth the number of the stars. He calleth them all by their names. All right, in which that's twofold. All right, but essentially going into the specific creation of the stars. They all have a specific name. In Hebrew, names ultimately they tell the characteristics and the specific job that a creation is supposed to do. All right, reading this in the NLT, it says he counts the stars and calls them all by name. All right, so every creation essentially has a name. All right, so going back to this, because again we're going into what's known as Kasayal. All right, that specific constellation. All right, in which we'll get more information in the kingdom. All right, but just providing for the information that we do have. So it says kasal, all right, because that's the root word for kasayal, and it says the loins as the seat of one's confidence, foolish or proper. And a physical example that we have of this what encompasses the loins. All right, a belt, a duty belt, and that's a seat of one's confidence in the physical world. All right, so and we have examples of that, with police officers, military troops, security, so on and so forth. That's the seat of their confidence, will be their duty belt. All right, in which that specific constellation embodies or essentially illustrates this. All right, because when we scroll down, because this is the root word right here, kasal, and it says kasayal right here. It says one who has confidence in something vain or empty. All right, and again, that specific constellation had what's known as a belt. All right, and so let me see. We'll get this. We'll get Job chapter 38 and verse 3. And it says, gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. All right, because right here it says the loins as the seat of one's confidence, foolish or proper. So what do you gird up the loins with? All right, this word for gird is azar, and it says gird, encompass, equip, cloth, to gird on, metaphorical of strength. It says be girded, hold close, clasp, gird oneself for war. And what do you gird yourself for war with? With a duty belt. That's why it says right here to belt, to bind. All right, gird up right here. It says right here, going down to the bottom, it says to gird oneself, i.e. arm oneself to prepare for battle. All right, and again, that duty belt, troops, all right, law enforcement, security, those that have those type of like tactical jobs, they be using like duty belts, so that essentially is their that's their strength, so let's get this real fast, because again, this specific constellation embodies or illustrates it's known as it's foolish, right? Because it has that again, it illustrates a belt, right? It has those stars and what seems as a belt. Verse 5, it says, Jeremiah 17 and 5, it says, thus saith the Lord, cursed be the man that trusteth in man and maketh flesh his arm, and whose heart departed from the Lord. So it's metaphorical. All right, it's a poetic way of saying something that appears as a person. All right, and if a person was a person will be foolish. All right, if they ultimately essentially abided in their own strength. All right, they would be foolish, if they were essentially abiding and they were trusting in themselves. All right. So again, that's why that it has a name as Kasayal, because it's a perfect illustration as to someone that will essentially be trusting in themselves, because it has that belt. All right, so going back to Job chapter 38 and verse 32. And it says, canst thou bring forth Mazarath in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Verse 31 again, it says, canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? All right, in which that's a rhetorical question. It's just like Jeremiah, the 5th chapter, all right, going into how the Lord has essentially placed the bounds of the sea at a perpetual decree, roughly paraphrasing, in which the sea, it can't change, it can't change the shoreline, all right, unless the Lord wanted it to. All right, verse 31, it says, canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? All right, and those specific things are abiding by the Lord's will. So the answer to that, it's a rhetorical question, because the answer to that would be no, unless the Lord ultimately wanted it to happen. Verse 32, it says, canst thou bring forth Mazarath in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? All right, and this is the specific one I was talking about. It says Ayash, and it says a constellation, Great Bear Ursa Major. All right, that's what scientists, or not scientists, so-called scholars know it as. It says perhaps from its migration through the heavens. All right, and we'll get some information right here. It says a very bright northern constellation. It says which we, in common with the Greeks and Romans, called the Wain. It says I'm gonna skip down. It says right here. It says hold on. It says nightly watcher, from the root to go about by night. And this constellation he's supposed to be so called because it's never setting. All right, in which when you go into the two letters, all right, that's in a specific word, you got the I and then you got the Sha. All right, it will be known as Ayash or Aish. All right, in which again um it has the I and the Sha. So the I ultimately goes into how you watch with your eyes. All right, and then the Sha goes into pressure. So it watches in pressure, going into where it says nightly watcher. Right here it says nightly watcher. Then it says to go about by night. And going back to the scripture right here, Job 38 and 32, it says, "Canst thou bring forth Mazarath in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his son?" So let's get this in the NLT. And it says, "Can you direct the constellations through the seasons, or guide the bear with her cubs across the heavens?" Because the stars, they essentially they move. All right, they move however the Lord has it essentially being done, but they're able to move, and again it appears again what so-called scholars call a bear. All right, and this is what it looks like right here. So hold up. This is a better picture right here. But this right here is what they call the North Star. All right, and this is where it points to it. But this is what Arcturus goes into Ayash. All right, in which again each stars or the stars and the ordinances of heaven ultimately have purposes. All right, and let's get that real fast. This is Psalms chapter 139, and we'll get verse. Let me see. Psalms 136. And verse 9. And it says, "The moon and stars to rule by night, for his mercy endureth forever." And look at this word for rule. And it says Mamashallah. And it says rule, dominion. It says jurisdiction. All right, it says chief ruler. So essentially it has a specific set of instructions. All right, it goes back to the foundations of how the Lord essentially set creation. So let's get that too. This is Psalms 82 and verse 5, and it says, "They know not, neither will they understand. They walk on in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are out of course." And what the everything in creation was set at a specific way. All right, due to who is ruling. Esau Edom, he's throwing everything out of whack. All right, because again, you have a wicked way. All right, what they know as astrology and astronomy. On this side. All right, but then it's a righteous way to use the different ordinances of the heavens. All right, which Esau ultimately uses these things out of balance. All right, going into the left hand side, you see, which we have certain knowledge about, the heavens and things of that nature. All right, but that will be returned fully, in the kingdom, excuse me. So I'm gonna get this real fast. It says, I got this right here. It says celestial navigation is navigation by observation of positions of celestial bodies, inclusive of the sun, moon, planets, and certain stars. So that's one way that it's been used. Is what they call celestial navigation. Pretty much using the stars to navigate. That was seen in times of antiquity. Like to where in this side of the hemisphere, if during the nighttime, if you see the North Star, you pretty much will follow it until it was a certain specific way that you would follow the North Star. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, if it dropped closer to the horizon as you was walking, that meant that you was going south. But if it stayed pretty much, if it got higher as you was walking towards the north, all right, that meant that you was going north. All right. So let's also get, we'll also get this. This is, we'll get Acts chapter 27. Actually, let me get this first. This is First Chronicles 12 and 32. And it says, in the children of in the children of Issachar, which were men that had understanding of the times, to know what Yashar Allah ought do, the heads of them were 200, and all their brethren were at their commandment. All right, let's get this word for times. And it says ait. It says time, experiences, fortunes, occurrence, occasion. All right, going into the interlinear, and it says proper time and opportunity. It says right here, it says at every time, every season. It says who know the times, astrologers, the vicissitudes of things, events, because you can measure, what season you in based off of what constellation is being seen. So going into how all the foundations of the earth are out of course. Roughly paraphrasing this, another scripture that goes into how he's changed times and laws and seasons. Esau, just because of, he's made to be the wicked, he chooses specific constellations to ultimately place in certain seasons. So for example, during wintertime, about him choosing whatever specific amount set of stars, he wants to use, he could throw off, different things, that's happen like pretty much during a specific season. All right, because again, the earth is supposed to be, the stars can tell what season, that you're in. All right, based off of the different constellations that you see or during those seasons. So what Esau pretty much has done, all right, he essentially has a specific set of constellations that are seen on this side, and that throws off the vibration of the earth. All right, and then also, the things like daylight savings time and stuff like that, that throws off our circadian rhythm and so on and so forth. And then also by him doing things of this nature, essentially, he throws off the vibration of the earth. So, but then it says Issachar, had knowledge, going back to the scripture right here, it says Issachar had the understanding of the times. All right, so it's a righteous way to do it. Again, stars can be used for travel. All right, then also it shows the different seasons that we in, which that stuff would be reinstituted, in the kingdom. All right, so let's also get this. This is let's see, just to prove that point on the navigation. I got a couple precepts. This is Acts chapter 20, and we'll go down to verse 27. Actually might be 27 and 20. All right, and it says shipwreck. So it says Acts 27 and 14. It says, but not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Eurodic. How do you say that? Hold on. All right. Hold on. It says Euroclilo or Euroclydon, northeast wind, a violent agitation. All right. So it says, but not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. And we being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightening the ship, and the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. All right, because I'm going to go into the NLT. It says, NLT, the terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and stars until at last all hope was gone. All right, I'm going to go into the commentary. So it says, on the open sea, when neither the sun nor stars appeared for many days, on the open sea they could only navigate with either the sun or the stars. Many days in this storm drove the crew to desperation. The great tempest drove them blind westward across the Mediterranean. So pretty much the point is that, navigation, all right, you know, present day, I'm not sure what they use present day, but I know in antiquity, in the ancient world, they pretty much would use celestial bodies like the stars and stuff like that to essentially show them where they was at, because present day, if all the digital stuff was to fail, that's essentially what they use. I had a conversation one time with a guy that worked in that type of arena. They use like when it's super super dark, all right, and the clouds is pretty much out of the way, all right, you can use the stars at sea to essentially see which direction you can travel, which that goes into using the bodies in heaven to ultimately navigate. All right, and that's essentially how they have been used in antiquity. All right, let's also get this. This is Matthew chapter 2 and verse 1. It says, now when Yahushua was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born king of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Hamashiach should be born. And they said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, and thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Yasharallah. Then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child. And when ye have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned of the Most High in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. So pretty much the point, hey, as the scriptures go into right here, Luke chapter 21 and verse 25. And it says, because the stars, again, they rule. We got Psalms the 136th chapter in the 9th verse, going into how, the moon and the stars pretty much rule. If something rules, all right, it has a watch. All right, just as the prophets have a watch. All right, so it's been dispatched to ultimately have a specific job and duty. All creation has a job and duty. All right, because everything essentially praises the Lord in whatever way, shape, and capacity that the Lord essentially has it set in. This is Luke chapter 21 and verse 25. It says, and there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity the sea and the waves roaring. All right, so the sun, solar eclipses. All right, the moon, lunar eclipses. It says in the stars, so the stars, essentially have a specific duty. All right, and they are used to tell, they show signs. All right, the signs in the different bodies in the heavens. They essentially, that's how the Lord speaks. All right, I'm gonna get a quick precept real fast. This is Job chapter 33 and verse 14, and it says, for the Most High speaketh once, yet twice, yet man perceiveth it not. So the natural man don't receive of the spiritual understanding of the scriptures. All right, and what these portents and signs ultimately are saying. All right, but we understand, through the spirit that's essentially how the Lord speaks. All right, and also just going into, just not land backing, but pretty much driving home the point that, in antiquity, and even present day, the stars, they have a duty. All right, in which Esau, Edom ultimately has tainted the knowledge of essentially, the bodies of heaven and shit, everything, but we'll get we'll get that back in the kingdom. We'll get the full knowledge of that in the kingdom. But pretty much the point is that, again, the stars, the sun, the moon, it all has a purpose, all right, regardless of what Esau Edom ultimately has done, what he plans to do. Essentially at one point, man was talking about, blowing up blowing up the sun, blowing up the moon and crazy shit like that. But these things ultimately serve a purpose, in which they've been used again for navigation. All right, first and foremost, how the Lord speaks through the signs and stuff like that. All right, navigation. All right, seasons. All right, the stars have been used, ultimately for seasons. All right, because they essentially rule, So again, just wanted to go into that. I don't want to zaza bana palos where there's a beautiful edification through the spirit. Water on to Za'atam Yesh Lata Wab, Lord, as well. You have a good night. Washalam Lakam, which is peace unto you all. A Shalom.